Hey guys, thanks so much for joining me again. This is a collection that I want to reintroduce to you, and I'm inspired to share with you once again. It's a collection I worked on a couple of years ago through the Channeling Erik blog. Erik is a spirit guide that I worked with for a couple of years to channel guidance, intuitive insight, and information to truly help you live the best life possible. These are some of my most favorite moments and most loved content and messages for you, and I truly hope that it finds its way into your life and helps you live a better life. I want to talk about the self and how to truly let go of something. Someone must understand how they identify with it first. He says if you, no matter what it is or what you look at, if you identify with something or define yourself by something, there's an attachment there. So especially, he goes, let's talk about the definition first, meaning if you define yourself by something or some sort of label or whatever it may be, if you define yourself that way, obviously that's an attachment. It's going to be harder to let go. So a relationship status, if you define yourself as being married, you've created an identity that way. You've created a self, which is fine. That's what we're here for, he says. But in essence, to move on from something or to let go, we have to then be able to shed that layer. We have to know how we've defined ourselves by it in order to undefine or detach. So if it's like in a relationship, he says, let's say you've been in this long-standing relationship and then it doesn't work out, you get divorced. And someone is trying to figure out, how do I move forward? How do I let go? It just sucks. He says you have to look at the way you identified yourself as an individual in a relationship. He says, did you create a dependency on that person as a companion, or did you uphold your own companionship for yourself? Can you be your own companion, is what he's saying.
Yeah, you're a standalone model, pretty much.
Yeah. He says a lot of times, Mom, especially in relationships and in religion too, people lose their identity in those things. They lose their sense of self. They forfeit. And he was actually talking about this with a client the other day, and he was actually conveying sadness. He says people forfeit their discernment, their own personal sense of self and their own personal discernment among different circumstances. And that's really sad, because then they become so affected by the world that they don't know who they are, and then all kinds of other things happen. So if you want to really surrender, it's not just about letting go, it's about being mindful and asserting how you have identified with something and how you've let that something identify you or define you. So, like, for example, yesterday, I know I shared with you, my church pretty much kicked me out. Certain religion, they don't appreciate what I do for a living. So I kind of have, I saw it coming, but was just, I don't know, it just hit me weird, really weird. So I was asking Erik yesterday, like, I just got in this funk, and I hate when I get like that energetically. I was like, what do I do? What am I supposed to think of this? He's like, well, that's your first mistake, to think that you have to do. So just be with it. And then he started to tell me, like, unravel the ways that you've identified with that certain religion and how you've allowed that certain religion to define you. And he says, now you know yourself outside of that religion. So why does it hurt to let that go? And so basically he was really helping me see how thick that attachment was, how deep that attachment was. It was like ripping off a Band-Aid that was ingrown and under the skin. I was like, I didn't realize that attached. And it's just, and sometimes when we go through those situations, even if it's the loss of a loved one, he says, no matter what you're going through, to let go. It may be brutal and it may be rough and intense, but that shows you the level of attachment that you've created. And it's also needed because it's pushing you to higher awareness of your true self.
Well,
So
should we not even make attachments? I mean, should we not? Well, I am married, but I'm not gonna. That's not gonna be part of my identity. I just happen to be married. I have this little certificate that says I am, and well, I'm going to this church, but it doesn't define me. I just happen to be going to this church and enjoying their company and their sermons.
exactly, he says first of all, the less selves you create, the less labels you put on yourself, then the less limited you'll be and the less attached you'll be, he says. And then the easier it is to float through life and not have to worry about how do I let go, he says. So like in a relationship, you it's known you're married, you have that certificate. Um, but as long as you can maintain a sense of self in anything, that's the key, to know yourself in anything. In a relationship, you know yourself as an individual. Um, and, if you do go to a certain church and a certain religion, still have your own discernment. Don't ever forfeit that. Because then he says, that's where you open up the world of evil. But what he means is, like the ego, and that's where you really start to battle with yourself and struggle and emotional distress and all that stuff
Well,
basically floods in.
I'll give you a perfect example. I remember after Eric died, I tried to go back to work for a while, but it just didn't work out. I felt like I was going to do help more people doing what I do now. And so I retired. And this neurosurgeon friend of mine said, "How could you retire? I mean, being a doctor, that's who I am. That's how I define myself." And I thought, wow, because I never defined myself as a doctor. I happened to be a doctor, but it was never attached to my identity. If I attached anything to my identity, it'd be being a mom and a wife, but never a doctor. That was just a career, a calling that I happened to have. So, so
Yeah,
retiring was
and
not difficult for me at all.
that's interesting. Um, he wants me to share an example real quick too of another client that is a blog member, and she was basically suffering from her own addiction, and she was addicted to her work. And Erik was telling her, take away your work, take away everything you do for work. Now, who are you? And she said, I don't know.
Wow.
I don't know what things I like to do. I don't know. She didn't have any hobbies, and she was so identified in that one little box
Poor
that she
thing.
didn't know herself. So, but she knew it. I mean, she was enslaved to it, and she knew it, but she didn't know how to get outside of that. So Erik says too, um, for me personally, I guess it was a lesson. He's telling me that this thing that happened yesterday at my church was also a lesson in resistance, because I was definitely in this place of resistance where, Erik and so many others are opening my mind to so much more than a certain religion. And then I go to church, it was routine,
Right.
we'd gone for so long. Then it became like I had forced myself to go. And I felt like I just didn't align with what was happening there. So I still went with the family. And so basically, I'm living inside my own resistance. And Erik is telling me, he's like, you manifested that whole experience. So that's why I'm like, well, it's not a surprise that it happened. I'm still a little bit shocked, but what can you do?
Yeah.
So, and everyone's like, well, you should just tell them that what you do is good. And so it doesn't really matter. It's to remain in a place of surrender. Um, you don't put up resistance in
Yeah.
any way, shape, or form. Like, yeah, but let me prove my point. And I would rather foster the peace. If they're not comfortable with me there, then I don't want to disrupt their peace that way. So I would rather just surrender to the whole thing and be transparent completely. So now it's just a matter of me really being honest with myself, Erik says, and surrendering the identities I created. All these little false selves that we create in our head, like, it's the good talk and the bad talk, he says. Sometimes we talk good to ourselves. We create this happy little perfect person in our head. Other times we talk shitty to ourselves and we criticize and we blame. And we create all these different levels of ourself, and then we identify with aspects of them, like their characteristics.
Yeah.
He says when we can stop doing that too and let go of that and become more transparent, being just in the moment with everything and accepting it is mostly how you surrender, he says. He kind of like shrugs his shoulder. And knowing how you've defined yourself.
Yeah.
So, and that can be a limiting thing, he says.
And resistance, like you were living in your own resistance. Resistance, well, what resists persists. It's the key to suffering. When you resist and resist and resist and resist, you suffer. Like when I lost Erik, there was a lot of resistance I had to live through, and it made me suffer even more in my grief. So maybe you can talk to that about how to let go of the grief, the loss of a loved one. That's a hard one to let go of, the physicality and all. I mean, I still have trouble with it. I feel at peace that you're happy, and I know you really exist. There's no doubt in my mind. But I miss the physicality. I miss the face-to-face combos we used to have, and the hugs and things like that. So how can a person let go of that? Because a lot of our listeners have lost people that they love.
Yeah. And he says with his hands, he says, "You ready for a tall order? Because this is going to be a tall order."
Oh, yeah.
It requires heart and strength, he says. To truly move through and let go of your grief, or rather, he's going back and forth between the mind games that we play, thinking that grief has a hold of me, or I have a hold of grief. He said, which is it? Which is it? Because oftentimes we think, I just can't get away from this, like it has attached to me. But in reality, we have attached to it as our identity. Even in the loss of a loved one, even if he's laughing at me. He says, even in getting kicked out of your church, when you can accept what happened or be with, the circumstance, without employing the emotions, that's you can know it first for truly what it is, and then be able to move forward. But as soon as we pick up and employ the emotional thinking, then it's related to time, which then pulls us out of the present moment and just exacerbates, he says, makes it worse, makes the whole experience worse. So the more present we can be with ourselves and our thoughts, and he doesn't want to say separate or like disconnected from emotions, because you can't really be separate, but understand that they're there, but you don't have to become them. You don't have to pick them up and host them as your sense of self-awareness.
Okay.
But that's hard. He says, I know that's really hard, especially when you've lost a loved one. To truly rise above it is to not attach to the emotional dynamics of it. But on the same thread, he says, you have to allow yourself to feel what you need to feel, but just don't stay there, because then you are creating an attachment. So you have to be willing to he says, look at things differently. Meaning, let's say in my case, getting kicked out of the church, so to speak, I will probably miss the physicality of it, like going there for Easter and, every Sunday, Jesus. So I'll definitely miss the physicality of that. But he's saying to look at the emotional attachment you have to that, and then experience it, let yourself cry, whatever you got to do, but don't stay there. Don't stay in that state.
Don't unpack your bags. Don't unpack your bags and stay there. Carry the bags around if you want. Open up the suitcase, look at this shirt or that pair of underwear, whatever. I don't know where that came from. And then close it up and take it along, but don't unpack your bags and stay.
Yeah, because then that's when you get stuck. That's when you create stagnancy for yourself. And then you create attachments, and it's like one after another, and you just have a hard time moving through that. He says, be willing to look at it through other perspectives too. Just like you did, Mom. He says, knowing like, okay, first my perspective is this hurts. This is what I feel. I wish I could have done something to help him. But then you've looked at it from my perspective. He's at peace. I'm glad he's happy. I know he's free. So in any case, no matter what you're going through, look at it from different angles, however you can. Because that would ultimately teach you more about yourself in the long run. He says.
True.
He says, I don't know where that came from. He wants to talk about how people, he says, how people are all talk and no game, which means, I guess, like, oh, okay. Okay. What this really boils down to is shame. He says, people are all talk and no game. Like, yep, I've got this. I'm getting better. I'm moving on. We got a divorce and moving on. He says, so people, they get to that point, it's just a phase, like where they're all talking no game. What he means is like they're really hiding
pain
or trying to stifle emotions. Yeah, because they're carrying shame.
Yeah.
What?
Shame over what?
Well, he says they've identified with a circumstance like, oh, I'm the one that got divorced, or I'm the kid with no dad, or he says then they start to carry shame. So you have to, in the deepest sense, have an identity and an awareness of self outside of everything. That way, as you move through these stages, he says, you can move through them without them identifying you and grounding you in these phases, meaning like creating stagnancy and getting stuck through these different phases. He says, as long as you're willing to be honest with yourself, no matter who it is, you'll be able to move through these phases effectively. But if you think you can lie to yourself and stifle it, he says, I promise it'll surface sooner or later. It'll come back sooner or later. You might develop anger issues. You might develop bipolar issues because you've stifled it for so long, and then something that is just even slightly energetically related will just set you off. So in turn, we're gulping. He shows like this big gulping all these different circumstances and energies that are related. We've created a self. We've created a self that knows itself as someone who's lost a loved one. And then when something similar happens energetically, and we don't want to feel it, we just stifle it down. And so we kind of like build up that little self. And then we have this deep-seated energy tied to it. And it is an illusion. So it needs your attention to exist. So that's why it's always like surfacing and resurfacing, he says. That's why you see people that just want to snap because they haven't come face to face with, or people that just break down. He's like showing this lady going, oh my gosh, like crying. So he says when people just at the drop of a hat, go off the charts with their emotions, it's because they haven't processed. They haven't allowed themselves to process.
Right. But I did create a self of I'm a mother who lost a child in a very horrible way, but I don't identify with that as much anymore. I mean, it's not a label. It's not an identity anymore. It's just an experience mostly. It's an experience. So maybe we can start instead of attaching a label to ourselves. I'm a doctor. I'm a parishioner at this such and such church. I'm a mother who lost a son. Maybe we should just say I'm a Lisa who had this experience. I'm Kim who had this experience. Is that the way to go about it?
He says exactly, Mom, because then you can stay free from, or at least freer, he says, from the emotional attachments to any situation. And he says in this real funny voice, he says, those will get you every time.
Those will get you every time. I get to see him.
Yeah.
Are there any good attachments? Is that the root of suffering, or is it the resistance to the attachment? that is the root of suffering?
He says, well, attachments create resistance. So attachments are the root of all suffering.
Okay.
Um,
Or are there any good attachments? Is there any such thing as a good attachment?
he says he's going back to his old concept of there's really no good or bad. It's just
Or there's
if
there
there's
any?
an attachment,
Yeah.
it'll create suffering. But he says the true essence of me, Mom, or the true essence of anybody, um, has no attachments at all. That's complete peace, complete freedom. So I'm trying to get him to answer the question, are there any good attachments? And he's
Or
kind of
are there
like,
any attachments that don't create suffering?
yeah, that's a good question. He says no.
Really?
I said,
Wow.
well, what about my dog? I love my dog and I love to love him and we have fun and we play. He makes me happy. He's like, yeah, but when he dies, you're going to
There we
hurt because
go.
you're so attached.
Yeah, that's true.
So, okay. So then I asked him, I said, well, what if you're just attached to love and you're just obsessed with like loving everything?
Yeah, what's wrong
Like,
with
how could
that?
that be hurtful? And he says, well, I guess the way I asked him that vibrationally shows, again, an attachment to it being a certain way. Like if you go and just love and spread peace everywhere and that's your thing, that's how you know yourself. He says it's not really an attachment. Like actual love and that vibration can't hold an attachment. So just bear with me in thought here. He's like literally showing me like this tube, like this stream of energy, like just a bunch of little particles like floating around real fast, and they're real close together. And so this he's defining as love, and then he tries to put inside of those particles, he tries to put any sort of attachment, and it just keeps falling out. Like it just can't stay there.
Okay.
Because love is the freest thing there is, he says. And he's talking about too how he's going into the ego, how we get fooled by, even if we're attached to being happy, that happiness is most likely, he says, you got to be really mindful. It's most likely ego-based, meaning it's connected to circumstances, and ego needs events and circumstances to exist. So therefore, it's an attachment that will pass away and then create suffering. The only thing that won't pass away is love. So stay in love and you're free of all attachments. You're free of all suffering, he says.
So how, you said this other woman who was addicted to her work, you asked her, what are you without work? What are your likes and your dislikes? Well, how would Kim or me, your mama, see ourself without attachments? Is it like, okay, here's what I like kickboxing. That's an attachment too, isn't it? I mean, what does it look like? Who are we without our attachments? Go with either Kim or me, baby. Who are either of us without those attachments? What does that look like?
Yeah, he's showing a pure energy body, just pure energy. Even the physical body is an attachment of self that we've created, an identity, and so on. So kickboxing, he goes fur baby mama, mom, doctor, whatever ways you define yourself. All the hobbies, camping, anything that you love to do, push that all aside. And when you can find that sense of self that is aware of itself but without any definition at all.
Okay, that's it.
That's the true body of self. That's the true consciousness that is you. So that's when you become, like, consciousness, as Elisa, becomes aware of itself when self is known away from all of those things.
Yeah, I know that, Elisa. I totally know that, Elisa.
Good. That's the pure place of peace, he says. That is absolute peace. And he keeps using the word absolute. It's absolute. So if we could all take more time but it has to be self-directed too. He says this is something that it's interesting because he's showing like actually in the school systems like getting more and more kids to, instead of saying like you're bad or you're
Oh
wrong,
yeah, no.
send them, he goes, instead of send them in the corner and put their face in the corner to punish them, um, put them in the corner in love and have them spend some time with their self and go into their heart. And then, so he's like saying that that would be somewhat productive, but the self-awareness that he just described can only be self-realized. It
Right.
can't be taught by somebody else or given. It can only be self-realized if you're brave enough to take away all the ways you've identified yourself, all the attachments. It's a complete state of surrender, Mom. And it's a complete state of just being, he says.
Do you have any tips
It's
on
just,
how a person can get there? I mean, I know what that Elisa looks like and what it is, but there are others, of course, that don't. What do you say to them?
yeah. He says, he's just describing it still, and he says that it's just a state of full awareness. More of a state of observation rather than reaction and thinking and analyzing.
Right. It's like I observe myself, my true Elisa-ness.
Yeah. So he says for one to start, breaking down the layers to get to this state of awareness, to sit with yourself, he says, take a pen if you want and write it down. Write down all the ways you know yourself or who you think you are. And get out as many as you can. Do you think you're tall? Do you think you're thin? Do you think you're social? All these things, how you define yourself. And then you have to push it all away, he says. Then you have to shove it across the table and know that that's not you. You have to surrender your identity from those things. And when you have complete awareness that's not defined by anything, that's you. He just says it real matter of fact. He says, that's you. And he's just like showing this huge heart. So the reason why he's showing this huge heart is he wants to help people maybe foster that process. If he can foster their ability to be truthful to themselves and get to that place. This is all what we're seeking. We're seeking awareness. But sometimes we trip up and fall through the illusions one after another, and then we get like derailed, he says. So he says it's interesting though. He says this would scare the shit out of a lot of people. He says to actually think about themselves. Okay, you're a mom of 4. All right, well, take that away. You're not a mom anymore, and take away your wife title. Take away your teacher title.
Those are big ones.
And take away all these things, all these ways that you know yourself, or you think you know yourself, or you've defined yourself. And what remains without definition is you. And he says that process, it would scare the shit out of a lot of people because they are so attached. And then on the other hand, the people that can detach, he says, are often called jackasses. People think they're careless.
That if you're a teacher and you get demoted or you get fired, if you're really rooted in I am a teacher, then you're going to suffer a lot. But if you're like, you don't attach that label, it's like, I'll find another job. Well, he's a jackass. Yeah. He doesn't care about losing his job. So.
Yep. That's
that
what
it?
He's saying, I've experienced that too, where, people are like, oh my God, aren't you upset about your kids? And I'm like, no, it's their journey. It's gotta, I try to detach as much as I can. And they're like, oh, well, if it was me, I would be so upset. And I'm like, well, I'm sorry for you.
Yeah, really.
I try to detach, but there's people that are like, man, she's an asshole.
I know.
I'm just not attached. I try to not be attached. So it's showing, you'll see both sides of that, where people will be scared to death to shed those attachments, and other people that are often criticized for like not caring about anything.
God, damned if you do and damned if you don't, man. Tell you.
Yeah, no.
Anything else about surrendering, accepting? Is there any difference between surrendering and accepting, letting go? Any different? Are those all the same three things?
Ooh, he says that there is a difference, and vibrationally, he's making me feel a difference. Like when he puts me in surrender, I feel completely transparent. Like, here's an example. Like, let's say I put myself through some radical spiritual ritual of some foreign culture, and I just put myself through it, but I don't identify with it. I just go through this experience that they identify with. So to me, I feel completely transparent in it because I'll go through this experience, no attachments, and I don't identify myself with it. But then, so surrender feels like being completely transparent to something, whereas acceptance more is bringing it in, like accepting.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
just a little bit, though. I mean, the vibration is just slightly different, not a whole lot different. But when we talk about acceptance, it's almost like hosting something.
So you're like almost
So,
like accepting this religious ritual as a truth,
yeah,
at
yeah,
least
like
to
as an
some degree.
identification.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. And like rejection yesterday at the church, if I bring in and accept it, then I'm hosting rejection and that feeling. So instead, I just try to stay as neutral as I can. So that's what he says is slightly the difference between surrender and acceptance. And then letting go is that's all up here. That's just a choice. He says that's a choice. We always say, how long is this pain going to hold on? But in turn, it's us. How long are we going to hold on to something? And he keeps using the word regurgitate. Like we regurgitate things over and over just to
True.
make sure we still have it, to make sure we still know ourselves
Mm-hmm.
as that suffering. And as soon as we can let go of that identity, we surrender and we know peace.
Okay, so
So,
let go so that you can surrender. All right, so in terms of losing you, Eric, I'm supposed to let go of my attachment to me being a grief stricken mother and surrender. So, is there any acceptance? Don't I have to accept my. Isn't there some acceptance coming into play there at all? Am I not supposed to accept your death?
he says, absolutely. First, you have to be able to coexist with something, because if not, if you're not allowing yourself to accept or coexist with it, then you're in resistance. Then you're in a place where if you can't accept it, you're resisting it. So
Okay.
first, you have to be able to be one with it, um, and then. And I said, well, Eric, it's really hard. I mean, is it actually possible for a mom to detach from being, mom of Eric or mom of Cade? And he says, well, you don't have to detach from that identity necessarily, but detach from the responsibility that this person's life is my responsibility. And that's what moms and dads do. They
Mm.
host that responsibility. Um, when you can maintain, that I'm a mother thing, he says, without hosting like responsibility for their life. Because we often carry that shit, he
Oh,
says.
yeah. All right, so, oh, what did he say?
He's just rambling. He's like, we carry it so close and we nurture that bag of shit. And he's like, I don't understand why they hold that responsibility close. Like I'm responsible for what that person does.
Yeah.
And he's like, y'all, by now, you can't be responsible for what anybody else does.
It's so hard
That's
because we are responsible for them when they're little and helpless, little infants. We're
yeah,
responsible for feeding them, clothing them, bathing them, you know, wiping away their tears, etc. So as they grow older and have more responsibility over their lives, it's really hard to let go of that. So,
yeah. He says compassion without pity is key to not coming into the place where you start to host that
yeah.
responsibility. But he's talking about too, you have to be he says you have to be smart about it as they grow and children maintain their own discernment or develop their own discernment, um, and become self-reliant. Then we detach. We detach and know that they're their own person.
Yeah, they're going to
So
stumble, they're going to fall. We hate to see it, but we don't want to pity them because when you pity somebody, you're saying that you don't have faith in them to overcome, to prevail.
He's like listening to you. He's like, I want to listen to her talk now.
No, I mean, it's true. You want compassion. Uh, but anyway, back to accepting. So acceptance is the opposite of resisting. It's letting go of that resistance, right? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's what he was showing. Like, he was showing when you're in a place of acceptance and like when you allow yourself to just coexist with something, if it's a terrible event, if it's the loss of a job, you just allow yourself to be with that experience, then you're in a good place. If you can't accept it, or if you don't allow yourself to coexist, or you have to prove why you're right and that's wrong, then you're in a state of resistance, and then you're just feeding your own suffering.
And you have to accept in order to surrender. Then is that what you're saying?
He doesn't like the word accept. He goes to accept, and then he changes the word to coexist.
Okay,
like
coexist.
To be with.
All right, for example, with Kim's situation, she needs to accept / coexist with the experience of what happened to her, being kicked out of the church, in order for her to surrender and totally let go of it.
He says, yep, she does. And he says and that's what he started talking to me about this morning was, I was still feeling kind of crappy this morning, like, God,
well,
that's
sure.
just so...
It just happened.
And so he was actually telling me, and he's saying it again now, like Kim's actually dealing with figuring out why she's not accepted. Because I went through this whole phase as a medium where everybody thought I was a witch, so I had to hide it, and
terrible.
That sucked. But then, kind of went back into that emotional state yesterday where I'm like, oh man, so he's like, why do you need acceptance from that place? Why do you need to feel accepted by them? That's your attachment. And he's like, you need to look at that and coexist with it. And so that's where, because, everyone's like, oh, you need to call the deacon up and let him know, blah, 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 this and that. I'm like, why? So you have to be able to coexist with it, meaning you're transparent to it, he says. Like, I don't fight it, and I'm not for it. It's like, I'm not for it, I'm not against it, I'm just with it.
Okay. Well,
I don't know why he won't use the word accept. He keeps saying that, like, accept means you bring it in and you host it.
Accept almost means you want it, maybe that's what he's saying, that you, yeah. There's a want there, a desire. I want it to be like this.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I will have to say that I think what happened to you is a height of hypocrisy, because I thought Christians were supposed to love and open their arms to everyone. And I know that Jesus would be rolling in his grave to see what happened. Jesus did not say anything against mediumship. That was all put into the Bible afterwards at the Council of Trent. They wanted ways to control people, so they struck out any mention of reincarnation. They made mediumship taboo. It was all a way to control the masses, and it's just a shame that Christians would treat you like this and reject you.
Yeah, it was terrible because my husband's whole extended family goes to this church. I mean, there's probably 30 of us when we're all there, at least. And, drop the kids off at Sunday school, and then we're all standing around, and they said, can I talk to you for a minute? And I said, sure. And so it took me clear upstairs in the office and said, we're not sure that what you do aligns with our beliefs, and so on, and we're not sure you can maintain, your membership here. And I said, okay. It's just okay. So it was weird. My son was with me, so then he was like, what's that mean, Mom? Did you get kicked out of the church? So I was like, oh, here we go.
The same thing happened to me with one of my daughter's dear friends overdosed, and I of course reached out to the mom and, what can I do? Let me do something, bring food for the wake, whatever. And so she knew what I did. She knew about channeling Erik. I said, I tell you what, you can come over and take care of the dogs, because we've been having some break-ins in our neighborhood. It's like, oh, thanks, So you're putting a little old lady in your house because to protect your dogs from break-in. What am I supposed to do? Well, the thing is, she did not want me to go to the service. She did not want me to be in that church because of what I did. So she, yes,
So
terrible.
sad. It's so sad to me because, yesterday I just kept opening up to Yeshua the whole time, like, because I went for a walk outside, tried to get to feeling better, and nothing just helped. And I was angry, frustrated, confused, hurt, and I just kept hearing from Yeshua that many will hate you in my name, which is funny because, meaning like they claim to know me, but they hate you because of me. So that's not really knowing me at all.
No.
And so that gave me some peace, and I just was kind of like, it is what it is. So now we're trying to figure out, okay, how are we going to raise the kids? We need to get real with ourselves here. And
a Unitarian church, I'm telling you, look for one of those. They're open to everything, which is wonderful. So
yeah, I want to know the truth in their heart and not depend outwardly for that. So
we got off track, but Erik, is there anything else you want to say about surrendering?
He says, my favorite word, he keeps saying it, tatastu, he keeps saying it. I don't know why he's using like an Italian accent because it's a Sanskrit word, which means
wait, say it again.
It's tatastu.
Tatastu.
It means so be it.
So be it.
Yep. It's like amen in Sanskrit, like so be it. That's my favorite word, and I swear I'm going to get it tattooed on me someday. But Erik's like, when we look at surrender, and whatever we go through in life, be able to say that, so be it, and you help yourself surrender.
Let it be what it is. Let it be what it is.
Yep.
And to try to look at things as experiences instead of attachments. I think that's probably one of the easiest ways for me to look at it. That's an experience. It's not part of my identity. I'm not attached to it. It's just something I'm experiencing. So.
Yeah. He says one more thing I want you guys to think about. He says, when you go through life and shit happens, because it will, that's life, instead of saying oh no, say oh well.
Oh, I like that. Oh well.
He's just like, because oh no means oh no, oh shit, and then all of a sudden we're in resistance to what is. And then just say oh well instead. He thinks he's hilarious saying this. He's like dying laughing.
I like it though. It's good. Oh well. Tatatsu. Tatatsu.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, Erik. Anything else?
He says, I love you. And he's got like his hands like a pistol. It's like, I love you, Mom.
I love you too. Bye, Kim. I hope everything goes well for you. I'll call you right back just for a little tiny Q&A. Talk to you later.
Good.
Bye.
All right. Bye-bye. All right, I truly hope you enjoyed that message, and there's going to be plenty more where that came from. We're going to continue to share these messages with you and continue to channel Spirit to inspire you, ground you, and help you feel connected. Join our community. You can like and subscribe to this channel to stay in the loop with more content as we share more information. Also, join me online. My website is kimberly-ray.com, and you can find me on social media across the board. Join our community online at kimberly-ray.com. Feel free to submit your questions and join our retreats. We have retreats all around the world every year, throughout the year. Also, if you'd like a one-on-one session, connect with your loved ones. You can join me online as well. Social media across the board, find me on Facebook and Instagram as well. And as always, take good care of yourself and take care of each other. Thanks for watching, guys. See you soon.